W.F. Howes presents an unabridged recording of AdventureMice, Mermouse Mystery by Philip Reeve and Sarah McIntyre, narrated by Barnaby Edwards. Chapter 1. The Great Storm. A wild west wind was howling over the Mouse Islands. Big white waves burst against the shores. Rain rattled on the windows of the mouse base, where the brave adventure mice were waiting, ready to go out and rescue anyone who was in danger from the storm. Pedro, the youngest and newest adventure mouse, looked out at the booming waves in wonder. The storm was scary, but it was beautiful too.
"A storm at sea is one of the things I was hoping to see when I came looking for adventures," he said. "It's wonderful."
"It won't look so wonderful when we're out in it, saving shipwrecked mice,"
said Skipper, the leader of the adventure mice.
"This will be a busy night."
Suddenly, there was a flapping of wet feathers outside the window, and a grey beak tapped loudly on the glass. Skipper and Juniper ran to heave the window open, and a stormy petrel stuck its head into the room.
"Message from Big Island,"
it chirped.
"The sea wall at Mousehaven is about to collapse."
"Action stations!"
shouted Skipper.
"Ivy, Bosun, you come with me on the Daring Dormouse. Make sure there are plenty of sandbags aboard to repair that seawall."
Ivy and Bosun scurried off downstairs to start loading the ship. A moment later, a far-off flare burst like a beautiful pink flower in the dark sky. It startled the messenger bird, who gave a squawk and flapped off into the storm.
"That was a distress signal,"
said Juniper, running to the telescope and peering through it.
"Oh, my whiskers! A cheese ship has run aground on the rocks at West Wainscoting."
"That sounds like a job for you, Million Fledermaus,"
said Skipper, fastening the toggles of his sailor coat.
"Take the helicopter over there and rescue the crew, and the cheese if you can."
Millie and Fledermaus grabbed their wet weather gear and hurried off to the helipad.
"What shall I do?"
asked Pedro, who wanted to help. Skipper patted him on the shoulder before he followed Ivy and Bosun downstairs.
"You stay here with Juniper, in case any more distress calls come in while we're gone,"
he said. The helicopter took off with Millie at the controls and Fledermaus waving from the open door. Soon afterwards, the Daring Dormouse set off into the storm too, ploughing her way through the steep waves in the direction of Big Island. Juniper and Pedro were left all alone in the mouse base, waiting for another flare or another bird bearing bad news. But no more birds arrived, and no more flares lit up the sky. The storm roared on for a while, but it seemed to be getting tired. The wind grew quieter, and the rain stopped hammering quite so loudly against the windows. Juniper was getting tired, too. She yawned a big yawn.
"You should go to bed,"
said Pedro.
"I can keep watch."
"Well, if you're sure,"
said Juniper.
"I think the worst of the storm is over, but be sure to wake me if anything happens."
Pedro promised he would, and Juniper went off to her nest. Pedro was left alone. He felt very important, but also a bit nervous. What if some new emergency struck the Mouse Islands and he didn't notice? It was a big responsibility. He stood in Skipper's place by the big window and struck important-looking poses. He peeked through the telescope, looking out into the blackness of the night for any sign of more flares or signals. But he didn't see any, and slowly the night turned from black to grey, and a new morning broke over the islands, with the sky full of hurrying, torn-up clouds. Pedro realized he had been awake all night, which made him feel even more important. He didn't feel tired yet, just hungry, so he went quickly to the kitchen and poured some mouse-sized cornflakes into a bowl. They were made from human-sized cornflakes, which had been smashed into little bits by mice with mallets at the East Wainscoting Cornflake Factory. Then he stepped outside onto the balcony to eat them. And that was when he saw something.
"Oh,"
he said. The sea, which had been so high and fierce last night, was very quiet and calm this morning. and the first light of the new day shone on rocks and patches of sand which the tide had bared. There were gleaming pools among the rocks, and in one of them, just for a moment, Pedro thought he saw a little mouse struggling.
A shipwrecked sailor,
said Pedro to himself. But he could not be quite sure, because the mouse had ducked down out of sight behind a rock. It had looked too small to be a sailor, though. Perhaps it was just a mouselet, washed out of its nest by the storm. Or perhaps he had only imagined it. Pedro didn't want to wake Juniper without a good reason, so he went running downstairs to make sure it really was a mouse he'd seen.
"Hello!"
he shouted as he scrambled across the seaweed-slithery rocks outside the base.
"Get off!"
he added, as his tail trailed through a rock pool and a sea anemone grabbed him with its sticky little tentacles. He tugged himself free, clambered over a washed-up shampoo bottle, and there was the stranded mouse, sitting in a pool just in front of him. Only it wasn't a mouse. It was very small, and instead of back legs, it had a tail, just like a little fish. It was a mermouse. Chapter 2. Meepy.
"Meep!"
said the mermouse. Pedro tugged on his whiskers 3 times to make sure he wasn't dreaming. Mermice were another of the things he had been hoping to see when he came to the Mouse Islands, but Skipper and the other adventure mice had laughed when he asked about them. "Mermice?" they had said. "There's no such thing." "They're just tall tales mouse sailors tell," Skipper had explained.
I thought I saw a mermouse once,
Bosun had said.
but it was just a trick of the light, and when I looked again, it had vanished.
But here was a real, live little mermouse boy, and he showed no sign of vanishing. His tail was covered in shiny yellow scales, just like a goldfish, and he was clutching a soggy red woolen thing in his tiny pink paws.
"Where have you come from?"
Pedro asked.
"Meep,"
said the mermouse sadly. Pedro wondered what to do. He looked all around, but there was no sign of any other mermice on the shore, and the sea was making grumbly noises, as if it was thinking about coming back and covering the rocks again. Pedro made a decision.
"Come with me, little mermouse,"
he said, scooping him out of the rock pool.
"Juniper will know what to do with you." "Meep,"
said the mermouse. A big white wave came rushing over the rocks. Pedro turned and ran, with the mermouse in his arms, all the way back to the mouse base.
"Juniper!"
he shouted, running up the stairs.
"Juniper, help! I found a mermouse, and it isn't a dream, or a tall tale, or a trick of the light, and it goes meep, meep,"
said the mermouse. There were a lot of stairs in the mouse base. Pedro stopped to catch his breath halfway up, and Juniper ran down to meet him, still in her pajamas.
"It really is a mermouse," she gasped. "But where on earth can he have come from? I wonder what his name is." "Meep," said the mermouse. "I think he's too small to talk," said Pedro. "We'll call him Meepy," decided Juniper, taking the mermouse from Pedro and carrying him through to the bathroom. They half-filled the bathtub with cool water, and the mermouse settled into it happily and splashed about, while Pedro ran to the kitchen to fetch some food for him. Juniper watched the mermouse with shining eyes. She had loved the stories of mermice when she was a mouselet. She was so happy to find out they were real. Pedro brought cornflakes, breadcrumbs, and a sliver of cheese, but the little mermouse would not eat any of them. "Meep," he said in a disgusted tone when they were offered. "What do mermice eat?" asked Pedro. "I don't know," said Juniper. "I don't think anybody does. Poor Meepy can't stay here. We need to get him home to his own people. He's only a baby. His family must be so worried about him." "But we don't know where he comes from," said Pedro. Juniper frowned. In the stories, the Mermice live in an underwater city called Mousehole, but nobody knows where it is. If only Meepy could tell us where he came from."
Meepy was happily swimming lengths of the bathtub. The red knitted thing he had been carrying when Pedro found him floated beside him in the water. Juniper fished it out and looked at it. It was a hat, and it had 4 letters written on it. B-I-M-C.
"This is a clue," she said.
"Is it?" said Pedro.
"I thought it was a hat. And what does B-I-M-C mean?" "That stands for Box Island Mining Company," said Juniper. "That's what makes it a clue. This hat must belong to one of the miners on Box Island." "I think it belongs to Meepy now," said Pedro, because the little Mermouse was reaching out for it and saying, "Meep! Meep!"
Juniper gave it back to him, and he snuggled down with it in the bottom of the bathtub.
"So, maybe he comes from Box Island," said Pedro. "Or maybe he lives near Box Island, and that's where he found the hat. Either way, that's where we should look for Mermice. We can get there in my submarine," said Juniper. "I'm just sorry the others won't get a chance to meet little Meepy." "Meep," said Meepy.
Chapter 3. Box Island. Pedro had not yet been aboard Juniper's submarine. He was a little nervous of it, because it went under water, and Pedro had always thought the whole point of boats was that they didn't go under water. But he trusted Juniper. So he helped her put Meepy in a washing-up bowl full of water, and together they carried the little Mermouse into the lift and rowed down the long, long shaft which led to the submarine pen in a cave deep beneath the mouse base. The submarine was called the Water Vole. It was as sleek and streamlined as a deep-sea fish, and as bright yellow as a deep-sea banana. Juniper and Pedro carried Meepy aboard. The inside of the submarine was snug and cozy. It looked just like a neat little living room, except for all the control panels and wheels and levers and the periscope sticking down from the ceiling. Juniper started the engines, and the water vole sank into its pool. Peering over Juniper's shoulder, Pedro watched the big underwater doors slide open, and the submarine swam out through them into open sea. They sailed west, passing lots of little islands where mice were busy repairing the damage that the great storm had done. Pedro soon dozed off to sleep. When he woke up, the water vole was almost at Box Island. Box Island wasn't really an island at all. It was an actual box, one of those enormous metal boxes which human beings like to put on ships and send all over the world for some reason. This one had fallen off its ship and come to rest among some rocks with just its top half sticking out of the waves. When mouse explorers landed on it and found a way inside, they found it was full of thousands of smaller boxes, and inside the smaller boxes were toy boats and planes, doll's house furniture, batteries, and all sorts of other things mice could use. The brave miners of the Box Island Mining Company spent their time venturing deeper and deeper into the layers of boxes and winching their treasures out.
"Even my water vole was just a human bath toy until Ivy fitted some engines and made her properly waterproof," said Juniper, as she steered the submarine into dock at the big wooden jetty which had been built around the edge of Box Island. Mouse miners, in their orange helmets, came scurrying out of the warehouses there and scampering down the rickety wooden stairways which zigzagged up the island's sides. They crowded around the landing stage as the water vole moored. They were as surprised as Pedro and Juniper had been when they saw Meepy. "So you've never seen mermice here before?" asked Juniper. "No, never," the miners all said, shaking their heads. "But this is a Box Island hat," said Pedro, taking the soggy red hat from Meepy and holding it up to show them. "Meep," said Meepy, reaching out for it with his little pink paws opening and closing like starfish. "It's my hat,"
said one of the miners, taking it from Pedro and trying it on.
"I lost it down in number 7 shaft. But how did a baby mermouse end up with it?" "Meep!"
wailed Meepy, and the miner hurriedly gave him back the hat.
"I've got a new one anyway," he explained.
"That hat isn't the first thing to go missing down number 7 shaft,"
said a big grey mouse. She was Marge, the chief miner, and she was looking very thoughtful.
"Number 7 is our deepest shaft. It goes right down almost to the bottom of Box Island. Mice who work down there often hear strange noises, and things go missing."
"My lunchbox disappeared," agreed one of the miners. "It still had half a cheese puff in it too."
I found a whole box of plates and cups,
said another.
"And when I went back down next day, it had been nibbled open and emptied out."
"It's ghosts,"
said a little grey miner nervously.
"I've heard their voices whispering down there in the dark water at the bottom of the shaft."
"Is there water inside Box Island?" asked Juniper.
"The bottom of shaft 7 is flooded," said Marge.
"So there must be a hole down there,"
said Pedro.
"And if C can get in, so can Mermice." "Meep,"
said Meepy.
"Come on,"
said Juniper.
"Let's take a look."
Chapter 4 Mousehole. Pedro and Juniper carried Meepy back aboard the water vole, and Marge came with them. Juniper closed the hatch tightly behind them. When they were all seated in the cockpit, with Meepy in his washing-up bowl between them, Juniper pulled a lever, and the submarine sank down past the huge rusty cliff face that was the side of Box Island. The bottom of the huge box was wedged tightly between underwater rocks. It was dark down there. Juniper switched on the submarine's headlights as she steered it around the corner of the island. The circle of pale light went sliding across the rusty metal, startling shrimp and making barnacles blink and hide inside their shells. At last it lit up a small, dark, jagged hole where Box Island had been bashed against the rocks as it sank.
"So, that's why the lower levels are flooded,"
grumbled Marge.
"We never could find that hole from inside." "I'll come back with underwater welding gear and fix it," promised Juniper. "But first, we need to get Meepy home."
Pedro looked hard at the hole. Inside it, in the darkness, something was moving. He just had time to say, "Look!" before 2 mermice popped out. These were full-grown mermice, and they were carrying a net full of things they must have taken from inside Box Island.
"Blithering baboons!" shouted Marge. "Box Island's being burgled!"
Pedro tapped on the inside of the water vole's window and held up Meepy in his bowl so the mermice could see him. But the mermice were too startled at finding the submarine there to notice, and too dazzled by the submarine's lights to see. They dropped their net and swam quickly away.
"After them!"
yelled Marge. Juniper spun the water vole around and turned the engines to full power. The submarine shot off so fast that Pedro sat down unexpectedly, and the water from Meepy's washing-up bowl splashed all over him. Far ahead in the beam of light from the submarine's lamps, the 2 mermice went squiggling through the water.
"When we catch up with them, I'll give them a piece of my mind, all right," said Marge. "Oh, no, you won't," said Juniper. "We'll just ask them very nicely to take Meepy home to his family."
But the mermice were moving almost as fast as the water vole. Where the submarine had to go around the big rocks and tangled clumps of weed which dotted the sea floor, the mermice could find their way through the narrowest of gaps. Deeper and deeper they went, through whole forests of seaweed, and past the wrecks of ancient mouse ships, until Pedro began to feel quite scared. But he didn't mind too much, because he was an adventure mouse. And all adventure mice know that if you aren't a little bit scared, you aren't really having an adventure, just an outing. So he peered through the front window, watching the deep, dark sea, until suddenly he saw something. It was a light, shining in the gloom on the sea floor. Soon there was another, and then another, and another. The dark, stony sides of a big rock stack towered up ahead, and on the seabed at its base lay a city.
"That must be Lonesome Rock," said Juniper. "And that must be Mousehole," gasped Pedro. "The Mermouse City, just like in the stories."
The houses of Mousehole had big seashells for roofs, and their walls were decorated with smaller ones. Coral and barnacles had grown over them, so that the whole place seemed bejewelled. Light poured from hundreds of little windows, and bright banners wavered on the current like colourful weed. The two mermice from Box Island were still far ahead of the watervole when the city came into sight. They swam down into the shelter of its rooftops, and they must have raised the alarm, for by the time the submarine arrived, the underwater streets were full of mermice. Some were swimming, some were riding on the backs of crabs or seahorses, and they were all rushing to meet the watervole.
"I hope they're friendly,"
said Pedro nervously. He had noticed that some of the mermice were carrying swords made from the spines of sea urchins, and spears tipped with sharp bits of seashell.
"They will be when they see we've brought Meepy home,"
said Juniper.
"Meep,"
said Meepy. It was hard for Juniper to know where to moor her submarine, because there were so many mermouse buildings, and so many delicate coral trees growing in the parks and squares between them. But important-looking mermice in shell armour swam ahead of her, pointing the way with their spiny swords, and at last the watervole arrived at a kind of shallow cave in the base of Lonesome Rock. Juniper let down an anchor, and some of the mermice helped to hook it on a handy boulder. Then Juniper and Pedro climbed into their diving suits. There were diving suits for all the AdventureMice in the watervole's lockers, and Marge was able to squeeze herself into the biggest, which was Bosun's. Meepy had been snoozing underwater in his washing-up bowl most of the way from Box Island, so they knew he didn't need a diving suit. Pedro picked him up, and the three mice climbed out through the submarine's airlock hatch. The mermice waiting outside looked confused. They hadn't seen diving suits before, and they weren't sure what these strange creatures were, with their heads encased in glass bubbles. But as soon as Meepy woke up and said, "Meep," a mermouse who had been swimming right at the back of the crowd gave a squeak of happiness and quickly pushed her way to the front.
"Meepy,"
she squeaked as the tiny mermouse swam towards her. She took the mouselet and hugged him tight.
"Oh, Meepy, my own little mouselet." "Is his name really Meepy?"
asked Pedro.
"Well, that's what I call him, because Meep is all he's learned to say yet,"
said the mermouse.
"Meep, meep, meep,"
said Meepy happily.
"My name is Tessa," said Meepy's mother. "Meepy was washed away in the storm tide last night. Oh, thank you for bringing him home."
Pedro felt very proud.
"We are AdventureMice," he said, "and that is what we do."
A stern-looking mermouse with bushy whiskers arrived, riding on a crab who looked particularly pleased with himself. "You must come and meet our mermouse queen," he said. "Outsiders are not allowed in Mousehole. She will decide what is to be done with you." Chapter 5. The Mermouse Queen. The Queen of the Mermice was called Queen Frangipani Camembert de Mer the 44th. She lived in a grand palace with seashell walls and a domed glass roof made from a mixing bowl. Inside, the palace was decorated with tapestries woven from seaweed and clever portraits of Queen Frangipani's ancestors done in coloured sand. Small glowing starfish clung to the ceiling, casting a warm yellow light. But not everything was made of sand and seashells. Here and there Pedro and Juniper saw other things which must have come from Box Island.
These subaquatic sneak thieves must have been robbing us for years,
muttered Marge. The Queen herself sat on her throne under the glass dome of the mixing bowl, looking very beautiful and wise and grand.
"How did these strangers come here, General Angmering?"
she asked.
"They chased Horace and Hilary all the way from Box Island in an underwater boat, Your Majesty,"
said the stern, bushy-whiskered Mermouse who had brought them to the palace.
"How extraordinary,"
said the Queen.
"I always thought the whole point of boats was that they don't go underwater." "If you please, Your Majesty," said Pedro, "I always thought so too, but the water vole is designed to go underwater."
Said the Queen, looking at him in a very queenly way.
"And why were you chasing Horace and Hilary? They are two of Mousehole's bravest adventurers, who have brought us all sorts of treasures."
"Brave adventurers, my foot,"
said Marge angrily.
"Beastly burglars is what they are."
She was so cross she had steamed up the inside of her diving helmet. But luckily, when Ivy designed the AdventureMouse diving suits, she had thought of that, so 2 tiny windscreen wipers cleared a gap for Marge to glare through at the Queen.
"The treasures in Box Island belong to the mice of the Mouse Islands. You deep-sea delinquents can't just go helping yourselves to them." "But that's not why we followed Hilary and Horace here, Your Majesty," said Juniper hurriedly. "We needed to find our way to your city because the storm washed little Meepy ashore on our island, and we wanted to bring him home." "And they did, Your Majesty," said Tessa.
"Meep," agreed Meepy.
"That was very brave,"
said the Queen.
"You shall be rewarded. You shall have a house to live in, and I will have the royal builders make it airtight and fetch air down for you from the world above. But you must never leave. The city of Mousehole is a secret, and no one who has found their way here can ever be allowed to leave again, in case they tell others how to find us." "Oh, we won't tell anyone," said Juniper. "We promise," said Pedro.
The Queen shook her head sadly.
"It is the law," she said. "You must stay in Mousehole forever." "But that's not fair," said Pedro.
"You can't keep us here,"
shouted Marge.
"I have work to do at Box Island, sealing up that hole so your scaly-tailed scallywags can't steal our stuff."
"General Angmering,"
ordered the Queen,
"seize these mice." "No," said Tessa.
"Meep," said Meepy.
Said General Angmering.
"Look,"
said Pedro. While the others were all talking, a movement had caught Pedro's eye. He was pointing up through the clear glass ceiling. Something was falling through the water. It was a big, black stone, and it was heading straight towards Queen Frangipani's palace.
"Look out!"
shouted Pedro. AdventureMice and Mermice scattered in all directions as the stones smashed down on the glass roof. General Angmering hurried the Queen off her throne. Marge stood dithering in the middle of the floor, but Tessa swam over to her and pulled her out of the way, just as the ceiling gave way and the stone came crashing in. It landed on the Queen's throne and squashed it flat. Everyone watched, crouched under tables or in handy alcoves, while a few smaller stones came down. They fell quite slowly underwater, but they were still big and heavy enough to hurt a mouse.
"That's the 3rd stone that's fallen on Mousehole today," said Tessa. And it's the biggest yet. Lonesome Rock must have been damaged by the storm, said Juniper. Bits are dropping off it.
A frightened-looking Mermouse messenger came swimming in.
Your Majesty! Your Majesty!
He squeaked.
I've been to the surface. Terrible news! An even bigger piece of rock is about to fall. It will crush the whole city.
The Mermouse Queen put her head in her paws.
Oh,
She sniffled.
this is awful. Our poor city. This is the end of Mousehole. Not if we can stop it,
said Juniper. The Queen and all the Mermice stared at her. So did Pedro.
How?
He gasped.
I don't know,
admitted Juniper.
But, Your Majesty, if you will let us go and call our friends, I'm sure the AdventureMice can find a way to save your city.
The Queen shook her head.
If your friends come here, Mousehole will be a secret no more.
Said General Angmering.
If their friends don't come here, Mousehole will be squashed as flat as a pancake. I'm not entirely sure what a pancake is, since I'm an underwater sort of mouse, but I've heard about them, and I gather they're jolly flat.
Please let them help,
said Tessa.
Yes, yes,
chorused the other Mermice.
Save our city.
Meep, said Meepy.
Very well,
said the Queen.
Juniper, Pedro, you may call your friends and see if there is some way they can help us.
Pedro, Juniper, and Marge scrambled quickly back into the water vole. A crowd of Mermice swam with the submarine as it soared back to the surface. It popped up in a drift of floating seaweed, startling a seagull who flapped away with an angry squawk. Pedro looked up through the wet windows at the dark pinnacles of Lonesome Rock. He could see a crack in the rock face where the storm had battered and battered at it. A big, jagged shard was wobbling like a loose tooth as the wind blew around it, ready to break free and fall off into the sea.
That chunk of rock looks as big as the daring dormouse,
he gasped.
And it's probably twice as heavy. How can we possibly stop it falling?
Juniper pushed the hatch open and leaned out with a flare gun in her hand.
Whoosh!
Went the flare, shooting high into the sky. Boom! It added, bursting like a little sun.
The AdventureMice will find a way,
she promised. Chapter 6. Lonesome Rock. The other AdventureMice had arrived home at the mouse base to find a note propped up against the teapot. It read, "We have found a Mermouse, and we are taking him home to Mousehole. Juniper and Pedro. Kiss."
"Is it a joke?"
asked Fledermaus.
"It must be,"
said Ivy.
"There are no such things as mermice."
"Then where have Juniper and Pedro gone?"
wondered Bosun.
"We must look for them," said Skipper.
"Found them,"
said Fledermaus, pointing out of the window. An orange flare hung in the sky, far to the west of the Mouse Islands. As they watched, it slowly sank towards the sea.
"A signal from Juniper!"
cried Skipper.
"It looks as if she's beyond Box Island, out near Lonesome Rock."
Tired though they were after their long night, Skipper and Bosun piled back aboard the daring Dormouse. Millie ran to her helicopter, and Fledermaus scampered downstairs and jumped into his yellow seaplane. Soon they were all zooming towards Lonesome Rock. It wasn't long before Fledermaus spotted the submarine wallowing in the swell at the rock's foot.
"Hello, Juniper!"
he shouted, landing on the sea nearby.
"Hello, Pedro! What's the trouble? Have your batteries run out?"
"No,"
Juniper called back.
"We have to stop that rock falling on the mermice."
"On the what?"
said Fledermaus.
"Well, this is no time for jokes, Juniper. There are no such things as mermice." "Yes, there are,"
said Tessa. poking her head out of the waves beside his seaplane.
Yes, there are,
added dozens of other mermice, popping up all around him.
Meep!
Said Meepy.
Goodness gracious! Great balls of cheese!
Gasped Fledermaus. He waved up at Millie, whose helicopter came whirring overhead just then.
Millie, we've got to stop that rock falling.
Millie set down her helicopter on the top of Lonesome Rock. She got out and peered at the wobbling shard.
It's no use,
she shouted.
It's too big. Even if we can get ropes around it, there's no way we can lift it.
A seagull flapped overhead, screeching with annoyance when it saw that Millie had stolen its favourite perch. But seagulls had learned not to get into fights with the mice of the Mouse Islands, so it flew off again. A single feather came drifting down to land on the mats of seaweed that floated near the rock. Pedro watched it thoughtfully as it settled there. He said,
What if we could put something underneath the rock to break its fall? Good thinking, Pedro,
said Millie.
We could anchor a raft underneath it, and it would land on that instead of sinking down on top of the mermice. But it would have to be a huge raft,
said Fledermaus.
Where would we find something like that?
They all thought hard. Then Marge said,
I have just the thing.
Juniper and Millie stayed with the mermice, keeping watch on the teetering rock, while Pedro and Marge squeezed into Fledermaus's plane, and Fledermaus flew back toward Box Island. The daring Dormouse was just passing on its way to Lonesome Rock, but Fledermaus waggled the seaplane's wings to signal to it, and Bosun turned the ship to meet them on the Box Island jetty. While Pedro told Skipper, Ivy and Bosun about the danger hanging over Mousehole, Marge rounded up some of her miners and scurried over to one of the huge warehouses where the things they had found inside Box Island were kept. They were soon back, dragging an enormous cardboard box. A picture on the box showed a pillowy sort of raft floating on the sea.
These things are called lilos,
said Marge. Humans float about on them.
Why?
Asked Pedro.
No one knows, but if a lilo can carry the weight of a human being, I'm sure it can hold a rock or two. Come on, miners!
The miners heaved the box lid open and pulled the lilo out. It looked nothing like the picture on the box at all. It was just a bundle of rubbery yellow plastic.
But that's not a raft,
said Pedro.
Not yet,
said Marge.
We have to pump it full of air first. It'll be 10 times bigger and as light as a feather. You'll see.
While the AdventureMice spread the lilo out flat upon the jetty, Marge and her miners delved in the box and fetched out a foot pump with a long tube which Ivy and Bosun connected to a nozzle on the lilo. The foot pump was made for human feet, but when 20 or 30 miner mice jumped on it, it squeezed down and pumped a puff of air into the lilo. All through that long afternoon, groups of mice took turns to work the pump. It was fun at first, but it soon grew tiring. For a long time nothing seemed to be happening, and some of the miners grumbled and wanted to give up. But then the bundled-up lilo slowly started to change shape, unfurling at the edges, plumping up in the middle, and the mice all cheered and carried on pumping. But the mice were small, and the lilo was big, and the sun was going down in the west by the time their work was done. Pedro glanced uneasily towards Lonesome Rock. He could see the lights of the watervole out there. The wind was rising. That shard of rock might fall at any moment. Bosun and Ivy pulled the tube off the lilo nozzle. There was a horrible moment when it seemed as if all the air the mice had pumped in was going to gush straight back out again. But Bosun, Ivy, and Marge, all working together, managed to cram the lid onto the nozzle. Soon the lilo floated on the swell beside Box Island docks. It was bigger than any vessel that had ever sailed the Mouse Island seas before.
But lighter, too,
said Skipper.
Quick, tie a line from it to the Daring Dormouse. We'll tow it out to Lonesome Rock before night falls."
The miners lit the lamps on their helmets and stood in the twilight, waving as the Daring Dormouse motored away, towing the enormous inflatable behind it. Pedro ran to the prow of the ship and watched Lonesome Rock draw slowly closer. He knew Queen Frangipani would be leading her people out to shelter in the seabed fields around their city, just in case the AdventureMice's mission failed. "But we can't fail," said Pedro, clenching his paws tightly. "We can't, not after all that work." Just then, wide, white wings swept over the Daring Dormouse like a ghost. It was that annoying seagull from earlier. It was heading home to Lonesome Rock to roost for the night, and this time it wasn't to be put off by any pesky mice. Pedro and the others watched in horror as it came in to land right on top of the loose bit of rock. The extra weight of the gull was all it took to overbalance the rock. It toppled forward, leaning far, far out over the sea, ready to fall. But luckily, Millie and Juniper had tied ropes to it. Millie took off in her helicopter, and its engines strained as it tried to take the weight of the huge rock. Teams of mermice who had scrambled up the sides of Lonesome Rock held other ropes. But the rock was heavy, and as it leaned out further and further over the sea, it dragged them after it. "They can't hold it for long," shouted Skipper. "Quick!" A rope snapped, and the mermice who had been holding it fell over backwards in a heap. Another broke with a ping, catapulting mermice into the sea. The rock lurched forward. Millie cut her rope just in time to stop the helicopter being dragged down with it as it began to fall. The Daring Dormouse surged through the sea. Little pebbles clattered on the decks and the cabin roof as she raced under the falling rock. Pedro squeaked with fright. He shut his eyes and braced himself for the great splash which the rock would make when it hit the sea. But the splash never came. Pedro opened one eye, then the other. Behind the Daring Dormouse, the huge rock lay on the Lilo, like an overweight sunbather. It was so heavy that the Lilo was tilting over to one side, and so jagged that air was hissing out through lots of little holes where the rock had punctured it.
"Let's get it safely away from Mousehole before the Lilo collapses,"
called Juniper. She swung her submarine round behind the Lilo and started pushing, while the Daring Dormouse pulled, and Millie hovered overhead, shining a light down on them. The waves all around were filled with cheering mermice. The AdventureMice towed the deflating Lilo further and further away from Mousehole, until the rock rolled gently into the water. It sank down on a stretch of empty sea floor, where it did no harm at all, and made a useful home for small fish. Chapter 7. Moonlight and Cake. The poor old Lilo was too flopsy to take the weight of a rock any more, but it could easily support some mice. The AdventureMice jumped aboard it, and Marge and her miners arrived on tugboats from Box Island. The mermice came shyly out of the deep to meet them there. Queen Frangipani herself swam up to thank them for their help, and Skipper and the others went down with her to see the underwater city for themselves. A fat, full moon was rising by the time they returned. "Well," said Skipper as he pulled off his helmet, "it just goes to show you can sail these seas for years and still find there are things in them you didn't know about."
"What will happen to this huge, great Lilo?"
asked Queen Frangipani.
"Oh, don't worry about that, your queenship," said Marge. "We'll tow it to Big Island. It can be cut up to make waterproof coats and hats for mouse sailors."
The Queen thanked her.
"I am sorry we took things from Box Island without asking,"
she said.
"That's all right," said Marge. "We never thought there might be mermice down below who needed them. There's plenty in that big old box for everyone, land mice and mermice alike. Let's say everything that's underwater belongs to mermice, and everything that's not belongs to land mice. Is that fair?"
"Very,"
said Queen Frangipani, and they shook paws to make it official. Pedro and Juniper sat on the Lilo's edge with Tessa, nibbling snacks while Meepy played beside them. The lights of the Mouse Islands twinkled in the night. The moonlit sea shone like silvery fish scales, and far-off, unknown islands lay dark against the glitter of it.
"I wonder what else we'll find out there,"
said Pedro.
"Adventures!"
shouted the other adventure mice. Then Ivy fetched out her accordion, and Bosun came out of the daring dormouse carrying a big cake he'd just baked. And the adventure mice and their new friends ate and talked and danced and laughed and sang until long after the moon had gone to bed.